welcome to the living room of the city and to the first of the Festival of Cultures program for 2018. So thank you for coming this evening. It's wonderful to see you all here. Also, thank you for our fabulous guests who have come from Hamilton and Auckland. So we're delighted to welcome you to Palmerston North and hope you've had a good day. And welcome to David, who will introduce you to our rest of our panel. David Hall is an editor, writer and researcher, and he's the editor of the book that we're going to be basing our discussion on tonight, which is Fair Borders, Migration Policy in the 21st Century. So hopefully we're going to have a really wonderful, lively discussion around this topic. Also, I would like to say thank you to Bruce for being here, Bruce McKenzie, bookseller, with Louise Starr, who's maybe next door or she'll be here later. Thank you for being with us tonight. It's always wonderful to work with you. The best bookshop in New Zealand. I love it. It's one of my places to go. And I think we're so lucky to have such a good bookshop here in Palmerston North. It's a real power for us in the community. So thank you, and thank you for sponsoring the refreshments this evening. It's really, really wonderful of you. Also, Bridget Williams' books. Fair Borders is one of the Bridget Williams texts. Bridget Williams is a fantastic publishing company. They're a trust. The books that they publish, if they didn't publish them, we would probably miss out on them. And there's so many important New Zealand books that are published by Bridget Williams. We really, it's something that we also must really treasure and look after, because they are particularly special. We do have a display of some of Bridget Williams' books, and also the Bridget Williams text, which again is just a fantastic collection of some of the best minds in New Zealand. So please do have a look at those before you leave and stay for refreshments. And I will now, David will take over. So thank you.
Kia ora tātou. Thanks, Jenny, and thanks very much for organising this event. It's been great to come down here for this. So, as Jenny said, I am the editor of this book, Fair Borders, on border policy in New Zealand. There's 10 contributors to this. I'm lucky enough to have 2 of them with me here. I will start just by saying how I came to this. My background is in studying geography, but then eventually political philosophy. So that's really the framing that I kind of come to these issues with. And the inspiration was very much partly to do with being in the UK and Europe over the last 5 or 6 years. I saw, how the migration debate played out in the UK, and how it sort of spread and permeated the community and the national debates there around Europe, and sort of took a life of its own really, and saw that happening in America, and then saw a lot of that language starting to appear here, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But so this book was very much designed to try and get some different voices into this debate, and to especially focus on some younger voices and just get some other perspectives and different topics into the debate. So I'll come back to that, but I will let Arama and Andrew introduce themselves as well.
Well, tēnā tātou, I te tuatahi, ka nui te mihi ki te mana whenua, te arangi tāne, ki ngā whakahaere o tēnei whare, kia ora rau atu mō te karanga ki tēnei pō, kia koutou katoa, kia ora rau atu hoki, ko Aramarata tōku ingoa, huri tēnei noa Ngāti Maniapoto no Taranaki, ki te taho tōku māma he Pākehā ahau, no te motu o man, he Manx ahau. No reira tēnā tātou. Hi everyone, I'm Arama, and I'm a researcher at the University of Waikato, and I started researching immigration fairly recently, focusing on the relationships between Māori and migrants, because we feel as though that's a kind of under-researched area, and there's this real tendency for Māori and other people of colour to be kind of pitted against each other in Aotearoa, so we thought that was a really important area of research. So that's how I got involved with the book and with David and Andrew.
Kia ora. So my name is Andrew. I'm an engineer by training, so I actually work with computers as my day job. And if you're interested in sort of surveillance camera studies, come and have a chat with me afterwards. That's what I normally do. I got interested in writing about this sort of stuff because I'm a second generation New Zealander, so my parents are from Taiwan. They moved here in 1989, and I was born here in 92. And there's all this rhetoric that goes around about immigration and migration policy, both overseas and in New Zealand, and a lot of it is quite hateful. Not all of it is positive, and I wanted to try and figure out where this sort of language comes from. How do people come up with this, right? Like, a lot of the stuff isn't true, so who imagines this? Where does it come from? And that sort of led me down a path to look more deeply into politicians and what politicians are saying. We'll get a little bit more into that a bit later.
Okay, so I'll set the scene. So it's time to have a national conversation about immigration. I heard this line more than once last year, and maybe you did too. The funny thing is, whenever I heard it, I thought, aren't we already having a national conversation about immigration? Isn't this precisely us having a national conversation about immigration? Aren't we having this every day in different ways? You know, it's possible that my view is somewhat biased because I do spend far too much time reading the news. But here is some of the things that I heard last year and in previous years. I heard over and over again that it's time to take a breather on immigration, or time to turn down the tap, or that immigration was a flood, as if immigrants were water, as if our borders were seawalls that prevent waves of people from inundating New Zealand and drowning its way of life. I heard that foreigners were blocking me from entering the housing market, only that the evidence of this was it was a head count of home buyers with Chinese-sounding surnames, some of whom were undoubtedly New Zealand citizens like myself, in other words, not actually foreigners at all. And it wasn't only home affordability that migrants were being blamed for. Here's an excerpt from a column titled, "Sometimes Immigration Cuts Are Good and Sensible." Current migration levels have created a housing shortage, put a strain on infrastructure, and created transport congestion on roads, especially in Auckland. It's fairly typical kind of stuff from op-eds last year, unfortunately, but the article went also on to suggest that migration was causing youth unemployment and even adolescent suicide. But there was no sort of addressing of some of the complexities here. You know, what about the regional dimension of youth unemployment and suicide, and the fact that economic opportunities are diminished in places like Northland, which also happens to be where fewer migrants are settling? What about the impact of colonisation and cultural alienation of Maori who have higher than average suicide rates? Or to return to the issue of infrastructure, especially in Auckland, what about the failure of successive generations of New Zealanders to provide infrastructure to meet the needs of future generations, even at a level which is consistent with projected population increases? Not all of the national conversation last year was so negative about immigration, though. A former Prime Minister by the name of John Key, who I can't quite believe is 3 prime ministers ago now, time does move rather quickly. In 2016, he waxed lyrical about New Zealand as the Switzerland of the South Pacific, a bolt hole for wealthy investors who wanted to escape the strife of Europe and the instability, the terrorism there. In a sense, like the arrival of Peter Thiel, the multi-billionaire, is kind of almost the apotheosis of this, this incredibly wealthy individual who gets here on the merit of the money, but has spent very little time in the country at all. I also heard talk of a diversity dividend, as if diversity was a big win on the pokie machines, as if New Zealand could pull on the multicultural lever and be showered with human capital. But above all, I heard this refrain that migrants were vital for economic growth, as if migrants weren't water after all, but actually little particles of GDP, little economic units that we could entice here to improve our own national metrics. Migrants are good for business was the message, which was actually just another way of dehumanizing these people, of treating them as lifeless, as rational economic units that we could benefit from. And I'll leave the final word to Duncan Garner, who in December 2017 published his ignominious column, which described his trip to buy undies from Kmart. And what did he find there? As he wrote, "I started walking towards the self-pay counter. I saw a massive human snake crawling its way around the self-service island near the middle of the store, and it snaked and it snaked and it snaked. The snake was massive." Ultimately, this article was found to be in breach of the New Zealand Press Council standards, but it was really just the last in a long line of op-eds throughout the year that had a similar tone and attitude. And he also touched on this theme of the talk that I presented at the start. He wrote, "Is anyone leading this debate on how big we should be? No. Does it matter? You bet it does." So again, this call for a national conversation about immigration. But what are we being called upon to discuss here? Human snakes at Kmart? Or metaphors of water, of people as water? Or microeconomic theory? Is the problem that we're not hearing enough of this? Or are people not hearing the conversation that they want to hear? What's been left unsaid, and what do we as a nation stand to gain or to lose by hearing it? So I'm going to start off our discussion in as open a way as possible and just ask, over last year and the election campaign and the years prior, were we really not involved in a national conversation about migration?
So I think when you look back into our history, we've been having a national conversation about migration for centuries, right? All sorts of policy initiatives have been put in place to limit or support or otherwise incentivize migration at various points in time. There's a lot of history that I don't really know about, but the thing that always comes back to mind is the poll tax that was levied against Chinese people when they first came to New Zealand in the late 1800s, and they were forced to pay roughly the equivalent of thousands of dollars just to move to this country as a disincentive to try and have fewer Chinese people move to this country. And that was a part of a national debate. When you can go through the archives and find all sorts of debates that were being had in Parliament and in the media about the Asian invasion and all that sort of thing. And that's not to say that we didn't have a debate back then, right? They had a debate. Was it settled? Well, maybe not. We continue to have a debate. And yeah, absolutely, we're still having a national conversation all the time. I think that it comes to a point where you sort of ask, well, what's the point of having a debate, right? Are we actually getting anything out of having more conversation? Is it just giving a voice to certain groups of people who really want to make their voices heard, but may not necessarily be all that constructive? And so, it's a common phrase to start sort of saying, yes, it's good to have a debate, but at some point you sort of have to say, well, maybe a decision needs to be made.
Yeah, and I would probably maybe I slightly disagree a little with my co-panelists here in that while there were a lot of
wouldn't be the first time
kind of slogans around immigration being thrown around and people using immigration as a platform for their own political agendas, I don't really believe there was much of a dialogue, and certainly not an informed conversation that was taking place. I work in a Centre of Population Studies, NIDIA, at the University of Waikato, so I couldn't possibly suggest that we shouldn't be talking about population or immigration. But I think we need to be informed when we're having these types of conversations, not just terrified by the fear-mongering of politicians. And so issues around our declining fertility rate, this is important. Issues around our structural and numeric ageing of our population, these are important. We need to be thinking about the size of the population that we want before all of the potential migrants dry up, because we know that fertility is declining across the world, and many of the countries that we have traditionally seen as desirable migrants to come to New Zealand have declining populations themselves. And so these are all really important issues, but maybe the conversation shouldn't be about trying to manage the problem of immigration, but rather how do we see New Zealand in the future, and how can migrants be a part of that future? And it shouldn't just be a conversation, as Andrew mentioned, led by politicians who can very easily throw these slogans around, but it should be about actually listening to the voices of those who haven't been heard in this conversation. So the voices of migrants themselves and their experiences, and how we can make the process better for them, and also the voices of certain sectors of our population who have largely been silenced in these types of conversations. So Māori in particular, who have had a very fraught history with immigration and how that's been used to erode our political and economic power throughout, the process of colonisation and still today. And so, these voices need to be heard instead of this knee-jerk reaction and these policy changes that we make. We need to be thinking long-term, and we need to, make sure that it reflects the aspirations of all New Zealanders.
Yeah, because one thing with the way that I set it up as well is that the conversation as such is really a kind of a monologue in the mainstream media. And so, that does make me wonder, you touched on the voices that were missing. Does that mean that, that there are other conversations going on beneath the mainstream media which take a different form and that take a different approach? What sort of conversations maybe were you involved in that you didn't hear represented at the public level?
Yeah, so the main conversation really is a Pākehā-centric conversation, right? And so I wrote down on a bit of paper that there were sort of 4 ways that you can classify the types of people who might be impacted by migration. And you might say that there's the Māori, who are here for the longest period of time, and then there's the Pākehā, then there's the people who recently arrived, so let's say maybe 10, 20, 30 years, some of the more recent migrants, and then there are people who aren't here yet, right? So people from overseas who would like to come, and they're the ones that should be most directly impacted by any changes to migration policy, right? And so when you're having a Pākehā-dominated conversation, the other 3 groups basically aren't there, right? They're not in the conversation. And so we're seeing a little bit more of some Māori voices coming in, a little bit, but no one's really asking about the current migrants or the people who aren't here yet. Maybe people feel that they have less right to participate in the conversation, but they're the ones who are going to be affected. So that's my sort of view on things, is you sort of cut it up in that way, and then you realise that actually the vast majority of the people who probably should be participants are not.
Yeah, and do you have any ideas about how that participation might take place? Because, we were discussing earlier on in the day actually about the way that can be a really threatening thing especially for a recent migrant, because because your standing is already potentially quite vulnerable as a member of the community, and so to stick your neck out and to raise some of the uncomfortable points that Pākehā might not want to hear and might find discomforting and disquieting to hear about themselves and the impacts of their own views, that can be quite threatening and potentially could provoke a backlash and a sort of perpetuation of that vulnerable status in a community.
I think that I was despite some of the awful things that we heard in the lead up to the last election, I was slightly heartened by a lot of the human stories that were presented in the media about how these types of policy changes affect real people's lives. And I think it's there are those migrants, some of them in precarious situations, who are willing to stick their necks out. They shouldn't have to, but they are there and they're willing to do that. And there are those migrants who have, recently become citizens, who are feeling a little bit more secure in their status, and so their voices often come through as well. I think a large part of it is that it's actually on us to listen to those people that are already speaking and amplify what they're saying, and spread what they're saying within our own communities as well.
Yeah, I think the pathways to participation are particularly challenging for recent migrants. So, like coming to a new country and learning about exactly how the political system works, how do you actually voice your opinion, is a mission in itself. It's a mission that a lot of even local New Zealanders still don't understand or know. And then there are a lot of civic liberties and freedoms that actually aren't afforded to recent migrants, particularly if they're of temporary status. So, for example, to be able to vote, you have to have been here for a minimum number of years. I know of several people who I've talked to who are here on temporary visas, work visas, student visas, and they say that they're afraid to speak out because they think that Immigration New Zealand might revoke their visas. And while technically that may not be true, the perception is there, right? And that becomes a barrier that sort of stops them from sticking their neck out. There are ways of sort of waiting for them to become a little bit more secure, gain residency, that sort of thing, but we really need to go out to them in some sense rather than waiting for them to come to us.
Yeah.
And I just think there's this real, really hideous way in which we cast migrants as being so very different from New Zealanders who have been here a little longer, which I would like to really challenge and see changed. Many New Zealanders think that we should have really stringent border controls, but are very keen to travel abroad themselves and enjoy the freedoms that they have to cross other people's borders. We talk about how high our immigration numbers are, but we don't talk about the fact that we have the second largest diaspora in the world, second only to Ireland. So we love to travel to other people's countries, and so we need to talk about the benefits that come from having relaxed borders for not just ourselves but for people coming to New Zealand as well.
Yeah, that reminds me of a point that I was involved with setting up a survey recently, and one of the questions we put in there was, have the respondents lived overseas for more than 2 years or not? And that was a really good predictor of what their attitudes were on migration and borders. Definitely, if you'd spent time overseas, you'd tend to be a lot more open-minded and a lot more, accommodating for different ways of life in New Zealand. And one of the tricky things, and you discuss, both of you discuss this in different ways in your essays, is that, despite some of these problematic ways that the immigration debate is framed in the media, that there also is like genuine social strains and social pressures at stake, like people's, these concerns about housing and traffic and infrastructure. These are not, whimsical concerns. They're legitimate issues. I know as well as anybody, I'd love to get on the housing ladder in Auckland, but it's a long way above me. So people have genuine reasons to be anxious about their well-being, but what's less straightforward is how this relates to migration. And so it really does raise this question of how we should be thinking and how we should be talking about these relations between migration and some of these infrastructure issues that we really are facing and do need genuine solutions to.
Yeah, I think what I wrote about was that all of these issues are quite complex, and for some reason we like to simplify it down and just say increased migration equals higher house prices, or increased migration equals more crime, or that sort of causal relationship is sort of claimed, when A, there's often very little evidence to support that, and B, even if you kicked out all of the migrants tomorrow, those problems would probably still exist, right? And so by sort of focusing all of the debate on whether or not migrants should be allowed or not, and that first of all sets up the assumption that, okay, migrants are the cause of the problem, therefore we should reduce them. That's an assumption that you're already accepting if you're debating whether or not we should have more or fewer. But secondly, it's distracting. It's setting up this notion that if we reduce the number of migrants, then the problems will all be solved. And we're not actually doing anything about, in the case of the housing crisis, dealing with land shortages, dealing with opposition to townhouses or more intensive housing, not dealing with lending controls, all of those other factors that actually do affect the housing market. And there was actually a study specifically talking about housing. There was a study from the University of Waikato that showed that migration was one of the smallest impacts on housing pricing in the Auckland market. Yet that is all we heard about over the last 2 years. Yeah, I think just to note on the surname story that David alluded to earlier, I remember reading that article and going and seeing, Chen was the third most common house buying name in the city, and I sort of sat there and thought, well, where are all of my houses? I'm just sitting in a rented flat that's kind of damp and thinking, well, I should have like 3 houses by now, right?
As you mentioned, there's often very little evidence to support these claims, and often there's evidence against these types of claims as well, as Andrew's chapter in the book, if you would like to have a look, clearly outlines that the association between employment or unemployment and migration is not what Winston Peters might claim it is. And also, if we just think back as recently as 5 years ago when we had negative net migration, but there was still traffic in Auckland. There were still unaffordable houses in Auckland. And so, we need to actually look at our own policy making and planning if we want to solve these issues. And I'd like to add as well that for many Māori, for many Pacifica people, this is not just a crisis about housing affordability, but about homelessness. So we have real concerns in our nation at the moment for many people who not only cannot buy a house but cannot even find safe, warm, dry accommodation. And not just that, but also where there is pressure on the housing market, it's often Māori communities that suffer through, the loss of their heritage sites, the loss of significant sites for them, through loss of their own tribal lands, and also through the loss of their communities, the gentrification of Māori communities. And so there are real pressures that we need to address, but not by pointing fingers at migrants.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, because in your essay you do discuss, which is co-authored by Tahu Kukutai as well, and so, in that essay you both discuss this kind of unease and reservations that Māori have about immigration, or some Māori. But you also, make very clear that that's inseparable from the specific history of these lands, of this whenua. And yet you also mention how commentators at times have interpreted this unease as a manifestation of xenophobia or intolerance or racism amongst Māori. So I just wanted to pick up on that point and ask you to explain, what's this disjuncture here?
Yeah, so so there have been some studies that have suggested that Māori are really anti-immigration and therefore racist, and that racism is therefore the fault of Māori, which seems really perverse, right? To blame an ethnic minority for the racism that exists within a nation, which is not to say that there isn't racism among many communities, but just to try and frame Māori as being racist, I think, serves a particular function. So when we look at Māori perceptions of immigration, we need to put that in a historical context. It is interesting that we talk about current times as being like this moment of peak immigration, where for Māori, when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, of course we were an overwhelming majority, yet within the space of 50 years or so, we were a minority in our own lands. And so for us, that is probably what we consider peak immigration. We think about the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, as being the nation's first immigration policy document, because it very clearly set out that this was an agreement between two peoples because of the migrants that were coming to Aotearoa and the need to have some structures in place to really govern that population. What then followed was did not honour that document, did not honour that treaty, and so Māori have suffered a lot through that, through dispossession, through disease, through war, all of these strategies that have been used against Māori. And when war finally proved inconclusive, they then turned to immigration quite strategically and specifically and openly. They decided, the Vogel, the premier at the time, decided that immigration would be used as an alternative to war in order to dispossess Māori. So we have this history where it has been intentionally used against us, and that continues today. Colonisation never ended for Māori, and in a settler colonial context where the state is actively seeking new settlers to come to Aotearoa, we need to understand where Māori anxiety about being demographically swamped come from, that those are valid concerns, and actually, instead of excluding Māori from this conversation, let's start honouring the treaty, bringing Māori into decision making, so that Māori can get to a point where we are able to feel like our concerns and our desires and our aspirations for our demographic future are recognised, and we feel empowered and part of that conversation.
Can I just chew your ear off with one more question, just to follow on this theme? I mean, one of the lines that I just really loved and struck with me from that essay was this line about that there can be no manaakitanga without mana. Like, that really kind of struck me, and I just wanted to ask, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so manaakitanga, if you don't know, means hospitality, generosity, taking care of visitors. And when we talk about immigration, there's often this challenge that is thrown at Māori, like, well, you should manaaki, you should manaaki these people that are coming to Aotearoa. And that's true, and we should, and we do. And we talk about in the book how whenever there's a natural disaster, whenever there's a housing crisis, all these types of events, it's often Māori that are the first to open their doors to be hospitable. But to ask Māori to do that in the context where we have many challenges and issues within our own communities, and our mana, our authority, our tribal authority has been seriously eroded, and the Treaty of Waitangi is not being upheld, to then ask these impoverished communities, for the most part, who are held together by people largely on a voluntary basis, to then be the ones to integrate foreign people to Aotearoa, it's a pretty heavy burden to then try and put on Māori. So manaakitanga is really central to our value system. We do take it really seriously, but our authority needs to be valued. We need to have tinoranga tiratanga, or self-determination, in order to really fully express manaakitanga to people that are coming here.
Yeah, so legitimate issues that need to be addressed, but finding different ways of speaking about this and talking about this. Andrew, in your essay, you mentioned how some people complain that it's impossible to talk about migration and its impacts without being accused of racism, which, I think is an over-exaggeration, I'm sure. But you argue that argue in the essay that you don't think that's the case, that it is possible to talk about migration and ways to manage migration and its consequences. So what are some of the rules of thumb of how to talk about migration policy in a way that doesn't deserve this criticism of racism?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, and it's one that I grappled with for a really long time. And it's actually not in the book, because I sort of thought about this even after we had to submit our chapters. And I was talking to a student earlier today at Palmerston North Girls High School, where we had a talk earlier today. And what we were sort of thinking about was sort of saying, well, a lot of times people talk about things in the migration debate, and then it gets shut down over cause of racism. And even the people who are sort of on the fence just hate the debate being shut down in that way. And what we were sort of thinking about was, is there something else that we can appeal to? Why is racism bad, right? So racism is bad because they're essentially treating some people differently to other people. It's the same with most other isms. And if you think about approaching it from that direction, then maybe there is a way to say, okay, well, it's not that you're racist, well, even though you are, but it's not that you're racist, but maybe there's something here about needing to treat other people with respect. Needing to treat other people the same way that you would like to be treated. And I made the comment earlier today as well that almost every culture in the world has some form of the golden rule, to treat others the way that you would like to be treated. And somewhere along the line, we all thought that this was a good idea, and then somehow more recently that idea has started to disappear. And I view the way that people can say really terrible things and hateful things is because they've lost that way of thinking. And so in terms of trying to have that debate without bringing in race is one where you remember that we're all people, we all need the same sorts of things. We all need water, food, housing, hopefully happiness, right? That's what we're all trying to aim and strive for. And we all face similar struggles. And so rather than demonizing a group of people and trying to say that they're bad because they're competing against you, is to say, well, why can't we work together? Why can't we try to be friends? Why can't we treat each other with respect and decency?
I think I'll take this opportunity to maybe open it up. We were keen to get a feel from people's thoughts and what was, burning in your minds about this issue, whether the discussion so far has raised any issues or questions. We'd just like to invite any thoughts or questions at this stage.
I applaud you three for looking at it and to present this tonight. But I think it's important to realize that we're all going to be equal, that we look at the fact that we are all immigrants. And then there's a distinction between refugees as such, which hasn't come up at all, where we sign international agreements to take in certain people. There's so much to be done at the political level. And as for Auckland, it's a Kiwi problem. So if we start presenting things in the way that it's not them that is doing this to us, it's all of us who have come here from somewhere that are doing it to ourselves.
Yes, it's like people stuck in traffic complaining about traffic, isn't it?
1840 was a good example. Yeah, you can come, but oh my God, so many of you?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing to get people to admit that, right? That a lot of these problems are probably of our own making. If you look at population growth, it's been at, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I figured it out to be about between 0.8 and 1.5% over the last couple of years, which is about the same as Australia, and it is probably what should be considered as a manageable level of population growth. And we've had that level's been there for about a decade, and if people were thinking about it, we probably could have planned for it. And now it's apparent that maybe we didn't. And it's hard for people to accept that actually, it's not the fact that the migrants are coming, it's the fact that we weren't ready for them. That's sort of my thought.
And one of the huge ironies here really is that this responsibility is being displaced precisely onto the people who have been here for the least amount of time and therefore have had the least capacity, both as time and both as a citizen or as a political member, to even have the capacity to make these changes through voting or through funding decisions. So it is an enormous irony, that issue.
Yeah, and just to pick up on one of the statements that we heard there, just to present an opposing view, really is just to talk about the statement that we're all immigrants. Like, that's true. We have all come here at some point in time, but we also just need to, when we acknowledge that, and we do need to acknowledge that, we also need to think about the differences between us as well, the different experiences that we have, and the way that our histories have shaped our current experiences. And so for Māori, we migrated here. We had our particular set of terrible experiences through colonisation. So when Māori experiences are compared to the settler colonial state that was established here, our experiences are very different as a result. So when white settlers came to Aotearoa, they set up the institutions that they wanted in their own image, and they benefit to this day through those institutions. And when migrants come today, particularly migrants of colour, they experience the institutional racism that is part of our structures and our systems. And so we are all immigrants to these lands, but we do have different experiences in these lands.
You read a question?
Yes. I just wanted to comment that I've had the good fortune of listening to Paul Spoonley speak about immigration in different forums. And one of the things to note is, on the one hand, we hear all this talk about immigrants overrunning this country. And then at the same time, we have this parallel conversation about the hollowing out of the provinces, the depopulation and the emptying out and the lack of anything happening. Yeah? They're dying. So that seems to suggest that on the one hand, you do need immigrants, but they need to be redistributed. How immigration happens, where people live, what opportunities there are, that's a kind of an internal infrastructural problem. For the viable life of this country, for all the reasons you've already pointed to, the decrease in fertility, the depopulation, the aging population, how can we think of this country in the future without the bonus of immigration?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really important points that you mentioned there, with population changes that are happening in Aotearoa, and we're already using immigration as a major way of challenging some of those issues. So it is often in the region where you find work schemes where we bring in immigrants temporarily and exploit their labour and then send them home. So we are using immigrant labour at the moment in those contexts to address some of those challenges. But I would like to see a much more long-term solution and view to these issues. And I think that actually, some colleagues of mine at the University of Waikato, Tahu Kukutai again, and Naomi Simmons and John Rykes, they wrote a really good chapter in a book called Rebooting the Regions, where they talked about the place of Māori in these conversations, because Māori are tribally based. We're based in, across Aotearoa, including, of course, in all of the regions. We have a really long-term vision and view for the regions, and we're very deeply invested in those regions. And so talking to Māori, to mana whenua, about these issues, they can be really a key driver in addressing some of these issues and coming up with solutions.
Yeah, sort of speaking to skill shortages more generally, I think if you've got a skill shortage, whether that's in a particular industry or in a region, there's sort of three main ways that you can address that. One is through education, to try and get people to work in those industries or in those areas. One is to, at a top level, decide that that industry can no longer exist, or that everybody should just move out of the regions. Or the other one is to fill that with immigration, right? And so the first one is a really long-term strategy that requires essentially a crystal ball to figure out what's going to be needed in 20 years' time. The second one is generally unpalatable to the people who are still involved in those industries or the people who are living in the regions who don't want to leave. And so you're really left with migration as this sort of stopgap measure that, as Arama says, is really just a short-term measure for filling the regions or filling those industries. And it still comes back to that first one of needing better long-term planning, whether that's through education, through other policy measures that will allow you to have a longer sustainable future.
Yeah, there's some interesting cliches here around the rural-urban divide as well that I think play out. There's assumption that, the cities are the welcoming place for new migrants, and the regions not so much. But one of the contributors to this book, Francis Collins, he studies temporary migrants, and some of his research, once again shows that all of these migration issues are so much more complicated than they look at first glance. And he was noting that some of the dairy farming communities in the Waikato, where he was doing interviews, they were finding that a lot of the old dairy farming families, they really loved this new influx of especially Filipino dairy workers, because they were like good solid Catholic families, and they were bringing life back into the towns and the schools. There were a younger generation coming up, and in a weird way, some of the older generation found that way of life more familiar to them than their own younger generation of Pākehā who wanted to move to the cities and were fixated with their iPads and all the rest of it. So it's just sort of, just always these issues seem more complicated than they look once you dig a little deep and start talking and listening.
Arama, yeah. I like you. I bring it back. Call for more information. Thank you. And I wonder, from what the three of you are saying, it sounds a little like it's all too complicated. And I want to have hope that actually the right research can be done and the right proposals formulated that grapple with the complexities of immigration, so that we can all benefit from it and we can all feel comfortable, and like the decision making is in good hands. I agree they're extremely complex issues and questions that need to be answered, but we've got some brilliant brains in this country, and in your book, do you lay out the kind of questions that need to be answered? Well, but at least the questions, so that people can be working on finding the answers.
I'll start by saying I think we're all in our different ways complete data nerds, and I don't think we have a lack of faith in the capacity for data and knowledge gathering to help with some of these issues. But I think, one reason why I just keep on coming back to the issue of complexity is just that, it's a way of having some humility about the knowledge gaps and some of the limits of data, and some of the ways that the data doesn't tell the full story. And sometimes you really do need to speak to people about some of these issues rather than rely on data all the time. But
I'm not assuming, or I'm not thinking about quantitative data, but qualitative as well.
Yeah.
And it does need to be really complex. I was thinking before that as the daughter of a refugee and the granddaughter on the other side of immigrants to New Zealand, I have this little surge of resentment about being put into this amorphous group that is Pākehā. What the hell? What about my rich cultural heritage and my experiences too? So one of the questions that arises from that is, okay, so how do we as a nation learn to be very respectful of cultural diversity, and how do we be confident that we can manage that growing cultural diversity? How do we model that being a possibility? All of those sorts of things. That's not something you're going to get figures about, but it will be qualitative research. But it's important to know, and important for people to be able to hope that, yeah, we can do this. There are ways to do it, and the country benefits from it. It doesn't lose from it.
Well, just to kind of touch on your own heritage that you've brought up, I think that's the first step, isn't it? And something that we're not always so great at, that mainstream New Zealand sometimes overlooks, is their own positioning and their own cultural heritage and their own culture. some people are not really aware that their views are formed and are part of a culture. And so just acknowledging often our own position, our own cultural values, and we all have cultural values, and realising that they are cultural values, they're not universal principles that all peoples should adhere to, is, I think, the starting point. And so having those conversations about your own culture with other people who are the same as you or different, I think, is the starting point. If you're a person of colour in Aotearoa, you've had those conversations. You are challenged about your identity on a regular basis, and so it's often easier if you're a person of colour to be aware of those things, and because your own culture often comes into conflict with mainstream New Zealand values and culture, and everybody will fit in or not fit in or feel aligned to those values to a different extent. But yeah, I think that's the starting point, is to have a look at our own culture.
Yeah, just sort of...
Yes, there's a question. I'll hand the mic to you. Just to respond to your...
Sorry, just a moment. Did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I was just going to respond to that as well. Yeah. So on the first point, I was just thinking that it is a really complex issue, and that we've all talked about the complexity of data, and I think that it is important for us to be able to say sometimes that we just don't know, and that the data is inconclusive. And if we try to claim that the data will answer all of the queries, we're just going to end up with bad results, garbage in, garbage out. So sometimes we have to admit that we just don't know. Maybe we can fill some of those gaps with qualitative knowledge. That's a good direction to head. But I was also thinking about that in terms of a national conversation, whether or not it has the capacity to deal with the complexity that we're talking about. So if we think about the entire conversation that we had last year, it was all based on a single number, which was the net migration number. And every month there was a new article saying that net migration has peaked again, that it's gone past 71,000 or 72,000, and most of the articles were missing out all of the nuance that we do know about, right? And this is a case where we definitely know that the numbers are actually permanent and long-term arrivals that are coming from arrival cards that are self-reported, that there are all sorts of issues with that particular number, yet the entire debate was, well, maybe we should cut that number by 30,000, right? And so to some extent, what I'm sort of saying is that, like, if we can't even talk about that properly, I don't know how well we can talk about a more complex, more all-encompassing debate. I think in terms of the second point that you were making, sorry, if this is getting a little bit long, the second point is that I think people just need to interact with each other more. And there is a wealth of research that shows that people who have interacted with migrants, or people who have interacted with refugees, people who have interacted with people of other cultures, are essentially less likely to be racist, right? And so this is a very, very big, broad point to say that the world is moving towards isolationism, maybe, that people are feeling less connected to their local communities, and they're more likely to find people that they're friends with that are more similar to themselves, and they can do this online. They don't need to talk to people in the real world anymore. And that is potentially dangerous, because that's limiting our ability to take advantage of diversity, essentially. And so if we want to have this world where we can all live together in harmony, it's horribly cliched, then we need to find ways to sort of facilitate ways for people to interact with each other, to come together and actually develop a better cultural understanding of each other.
And alongside that, I think we need to challenge all of our institutions, yes, and the racism that presides in the media and all of these different areas, because we can't simply rely on people of colour and on Māori to educate everybody that we're actually cool people, we need to, if there's racism within your own community, then talk to people in your own community. Don't rely on members of your own community having to interact with an Asian person that was a nice Asian person, or a Pākehā person that was a nice Pākehā person, to change their mind about those things. We need to educate our own communities too.
This is a question about refugees and probably climate change, refugees in particular. Refugees are obviously migrants under duress to some extent. we've got a government which is recognising that this is something which is going to be part of our future. Can we manage, can we run, can we operate a respectful refugee migration program when we have an immigration scheme, system within the country which seems to me to be rather atomistic and regard people as sort of transportable skills or economic units, as you referred to in your sort of opening part. So if we are looking at people as basic individuals, can you actually allow migration of cultures to New Zealand? If what we are seeking to achieve is a climate change migration policy, effectively, can you actually bring people in under a scheme which really recognises only individuals in that scheme? Do you actually need to recognise cultures, given that certainly European population movement to New Zealand was certainly an exercise in cultural translation. It was very deliberately an exercise in moving a whole culture and bringing it to New Zealand. So does the dialogue which is going on need to be actually more explicitly focused on transporting cultures, Filipinos to Stratford and various other places in New Zealand, as well as individuals into wherever they end up in the country? So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll fire off a few thoughts. I should say my day job is climate policy, actually, so that's sort of the other thing that I research. I mean, I think one thing is that you do have to recognise cultures and even more so like our special relationship in the Pacific region, and that as well has a historical background which also relates to colonialism of New Zealand being a colonial overseer of many Pacific nations, which does put a historical responsibility on us that we shouldn't shirk. And I think, the problem with the economic migrant, this economic lens where we, the background to this is that it sort of has this universalizing approach and treats everybody evenly. But of course, it actually doesn't. It disguises the way that it treats people dramatically unevenly. And, our point system, which we rely on for our work visas, has been massively restrictive to Pacific migration. It's reduced by about 30% over the last few years because there's been restrictions to family reunification, and there's been increase in the number of points which you need to get to get a work visa, and that all of that is disadvantaging for Pacific would-be migrants compared to people from other places in the world. And so, whatever climate refugee intake that they do in the next year will probably be dwarfed, in the coming years will probably be dwarfed by the amount who have been restricted over recent years. But I mean, I think that is an important direction to go in, and to recognise that special relationship that we have with the Pacific. And there's all sorts of experiments going on in the world where we diminish or dilute our national borders for the purpose of a larger community, like the Schengen zone in the EU, where there's free movement within the EU to recognise that particular relationship. And those are sorts of models we might consider in this relationship, because one of the feedback coming from the Pacific Islands is they don't necessarily want to be treated like refugees, like an object of pity, or they want to be treated as people with dignity who have a reason and a right to come.
As all refugees should be treated.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the point about the exporting of cultures and that sort of thing is that it does heavily depend on why the cultures are coming, right? So as you alluded to, cultures coming from Europe with the intention of suppressing Māori culture in the late 1800s is very different to the idea of climate refugees needing somewhere to live, right? No one's seriously saying that the people of Kiribati or Tuvalu are going to displace all the people of New Zealand and suddenly take over the entire country, right? That's very different reasoning there. And so the more deeper question there is then, well, can different cultures coexist? Can we actually achieve multiculturalism? And that's not an easy question to answer. I can optimistically say hopefully yes. there will be other people who disagree. But I think that's the more important question there is, as a nation, how will we form our cultural identity? Can we create space for these other people, or maybe we can't, right?
I just want to pick up on some comments you made earlier about feeling a sense of resentment about being lumped into this category of Pākehā. And so perhaps one way forward is to understand that Pākehā are the people who were treaty partners, and their descendants are Pākehā. And everybody else, black, brown, or white, are Tauiwi. The difference, of course, is that if you're white, you assimilate more seamlessly and invisibly. You don't look like you might be someone else, not Pākehā. That's the slippage that occurs that makes everybody else who came later on and not Pākehā look like they might be Pākehā. But perhaps there should be a retrieval of this term Tauiwi, that we all are Tauiwi, and then Pākehā and Māori are people who have another relationship and have obligations and responsibilities. And everybody else then becomes a party to those sets of responsibilities and obligations as well, having come later on.
Yeah, I'd probably just respond in one small way, and that is that the treaty was signed between Māori and the Crown, and so the way in which the immigration system is structured at the moment is very much a product of the Crown. And the term Pākehā is not black and white, sorry, but sorry about that, for want of a better term. But some people suggest that Pākehā includes all Tauiwi. Others say it's a European New Zealander. But then it might be someone from Australia, or it might be someone from other parts of the world who are white as well. So it's not a really clear-cut term in what the term Pākehā means, and it is inclusive of many diverse peoples within that. And Tauiwi, well, that Māori tend to use that term for all non-Māori people, Pākehā, and people of colour as well. So those terms are all very interesting and useful, and we should continue to talk about how they might be used. Tangata tiriti is another one that people talk about. So tangata whenua, tangata tauiwi, tangata tiriti, people who are here as a product of the Treaty of Waitangi. So I think that honouring the treaty is part of what it means to be a citizen in Aotearoa today. And so it's up to all of us to honour that document.
One last question over there, and after maybe we can invite everyone to pray and we can continue informally. Yeah.
If I'm going to be the last, it's probably taking us right back to the beginning again. You said you often hear it's time to have a national discussion about immigration, that comment, and then you gave us lots of examples about what it was, but they weren't necessarily informed comments. And Arama, you picked that up, that they need to be informed. And also the discussions ranged across immigration, but it also has brought in a lot of other issues of population. And do you think we should have an immigration discussion, because immigration policy in New Zealand tends to be reactive, not planned, it's very short term, or do we need to have another population discussion in New Zealand? We had one back in the 90s. Is it time we had another one? And all these issues could then be included in it, and also inform debate, and looking back at the research that's been done since the last population conference till now. I spent 5 years researching Chinese immigrants to New Zealand. I lived in China as a Waigwaran, a Guelo, a Dabezi, despite my small nose. But I had a position in a university, I had respect. And so I didn't get treated like the professionals I interviewed got treated in New Zealand.
I think the brief thing that I just want to say there is that I think if you're a politician, it's far easier to talk about immigration policy than to talk about population control. right? Like one sounds much more palatable than the other because one is not affecting you, right? One is not affecting the people who are currently already here. And so, yeah, it's going to take a lot of political capital and will to talk about population control, but I think, not population control, population policy. But I think you're right in that it is a much broader problem. Immigration is part of that broader discussion. And this is what I was alluding to earlier, is that focusing too much on immigration sort of loses all of the other nuance that's actually associated with the real causes of the problems that we're facing.
Yeah, and that they're not all problems. A lot of them are opportunities as well, and it's just good planning, isn't it, to actually think about what your population is going to look like. There's some really interesting population projection methods that we're using a lot these days, so I think it's the perfect time to have these types of conversations. And once again, I would say that Māori need to be a part of those conversations, particularly as our leaders tend to have a very long-term view of the country. We don't care about election cycles so much as our mokopuna or our mokopuna's mokopuna, so we have this really long-term vision, and I think we need to have those conversations more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I agree exactly with you mentioned the short-termism, and that drives the sort of reactionary approach to migration. It's precisely that short-termism which also is leaving us with all of these deficits in our infrastructure. So there's a real common cause there. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea of opening that up to a population policy discussion. I think it sort of operates at the right level. And of course, I'm sympathetic to the informed discussion. I mean, I think that's, as a sort of political philosopher, that's all you can really offer in a way, because I'm not the kind of economist who's going to come up with a perfect number of the perfect amount of right immigrants according to these economic metrics. That's not the sort of game I play. Like, it's more about how do you have a fruitful conversation, and because, all of these issues have to be worked out collectively, but they need to be done in the most thoughtful and empathetic possible way.
So probably not in an election year?
Yeah. So I believe we're going to draw this to a close, but thank you all so much for coming along and joining this discussion, and thank you for all your questions and thoughts. It's really nice to get the feedback about what everybody's thinking about. And oh yes, and we also have a book to give away. Which we
don't have a proper system for giving this out yet.
Ooh,
no.
What about a quiz?
A quiz.
Who can tell me what year He Whakaputanga was signed? The Declaration of Independence.
Yes.
Oh, well done.
There we go. Thank you all.